In the autumn of 1883, in the high desert country of southern Utah, where the red cliffs ran like old fire and the wind carried grit that could scour paint from a wagon board, a stagecoach sat in the yard behind Harmon Pruitt's livery stable and waited for someone to pay attention to it. It had been waiting a long time, 11 years by most accounts. Longer, said a few who had no reason to lie. The coach was a Concord pattern body on its original thoroughbrace suspension, which meant it had once been a thing of genuine value, built in the eastern states and shipped overland at considerable expense by the Garfield and Southern Stage Line, before that company dissolved in the confusion of the early 1870s and left its assets scattered across 3 territories like the contents of a capsized freight wagon. The Garfield and Southern's dissolution was the subject of a brief notice in the Territorial Dispatch, and the longer, quieter subject of whispered conversation in the county recorder's office for years afterward. Pruitt had acquired the coach in lieu of a livery debt he said he was owed. The paperwork supporting that claim was never produced for public inspection, though he referred to it often enough that its existence had taken on the quality of established fact in Cedar Bluffs. The Concorde's lacquer was gone. The body panels had warped in the alternation of summer heat and winter cold until the seams gaped and the framing showed through like the ribs of a long-dead horse. Both rear wheels had been removed for parts. The door on the offside hung by a single hinge, and the interior leather had been stripped out years ago, presumably for use elsewhere. What remained was the shell, the running gear, the floor, and the driver's box. All of it faded to a gray so uniform, it was as if the desert had tried to reclaim the thing one molecule at a time. Pruitt called it an eyesore when he thought about it, which was not often. He had positioned it against the back fence of the livery yard, where it would not interfere with the horses and would not draw comment from the customers who came through the front gate. Most of Cedar Bluffs had ceased to notice it entirely. Children climbed on it sometimes before their mothers called them down. The woman who bought it was named Nell Carver. She was 26 years old, and she had been in Cedar Bluffs for 9 days when she stood at the livery gate and asked Pruitt what he wanted for the Concord. He told her she was welcome to it for $4, and he said it with a laugh that 2 of his stable hands overheard from inside the barn. The laugh was not unkind in the way that a cruel man's laugh is unkind. It was the laugh of someone who had lived long enough to find earnest young women faintly comic. The coach could not be moved without considerable labor. Its weight without wheels was still upwards of 1,200 pounds, and the running gear would need full restoration before it could haul anything anywhere. The woman before him, in her cream dress and a red wool shawl that looked too warm for the afternoon, could not weigh 120 pounds herself. She had arrived in town on a public stage from Beaver, with a single canvas bag and what appeared to be a canvas-wrapped tool roll. She had no obvious connections in Cedar Bluffs and no announced occupation. She was, in Pruitt's unvoiced assessment, someone's runaway daughter looking for a place to be small and unnoticed. Nell Carver paid him the $4 from a folded paper envelope she took from inside her satchel. She counted the coins out on the fence post and pushed them toward him without ceremony. Pruitt pocketed them without looking at them, because he had already decided the transaction was comic and therefore not worth performing. "If you think you can move it," he said, "you're welcome to try." She did not answer him. She walked through the gate and crossed the yard to the coach and stood looking at it with her hands at her sides as if she were cataloging something. Pruitt watched her for a moment and then turned back to his horses and forgot about her. He was not alone in that. There is a kind of attention that a small town gives to a newcomer, especially a young woman traveling alone, which is intense and brief, and moves on to other subjects the moment the newcomer fails to be entertaining or scandalous. Cedar Bluffs had given her its brief attention in the first 2 days and found her unremarkable. She had taken a room above the dry goods store, the inexpensive room at the back that caught afternoon heat and overlooked the alley. She ate her meals quietly and did not introduce herself to anyone beyond what courtesy required. She visited the county recorder's office on her third day, which a few people noted and did not know what to make of. She did not attend the weekly social at the Methodist Hall. By the time she bought the Stagecoach, the town's attention had moved on to a more interesting dispute between two ranchers over a stretch of creek frontage, and she was simply the young woman in the back room above Pryor's Dry Goods, who had apparently paid $4 for that old wreck in Pruitt's yard. What they did not know, and had no occasion to know, was what she was actually doing when she walked into that livery yard each morning and did not come out until the light began to fail. Her father had been a coach builder, not a blacksmith or a wheelwright, though he could do both when the work required it. A coach builder in the older sense, a man who understood the structural grammar of a horse-drawn vehicle as thoroughly as an architect understands the load-bearing logic of a wall. He had built and repaired vehicles of every kind for 30 years in the town of Parowan, 40 miles to the north, before a fever took him in the spring of 1882, and Nell had apprenticed under him since she was old enough to hold a draw knife without being told twice. She knew the Concord pattern body the way a doctor knows a skeleton. She knew where the framing members ran beneath the paneling, how the leather thorough braces carried the load, what the factory tolerances were for the wheel seat mortises, and how the floor was constructed. She knew, in particular, that the Concord pattern floor was not a single plane but a built assembly, a structural sandwich of yellow pine framing, poplar planking, and in some of the earlier and higher quality examples, a shallow cavity beneath the passenger floor used by the manufacturer to balance the coach's weight distribution, or, in certain custom orders, to seat lead ballast blocks that could be added or removed depending on the cargo load. She knew, because her father had rebuilt one, exactly what that cavity looked like from above and from below, and what it would take to open it. The tool roll she had carried from Parowan contained a flush blade pry bar with a hickory handle, a small cross-peen hammer, a hook nose pick, a pair of mechanic's pliers, and a folding rule. Tools her father had given her when she was 19 and just beginning to work independently. She had added to them over the years, but these were the ones she had brought to Cedar Bluffs, because these were the ones she needed. On the first day, she assessed the coach thoroughly from outside to inside, working the way her father had taught her, which was to observe before touching and to map what you could see before you began disturbing what you could not. The floor of the coach was the primary object of her attention. What she could see of it through the damaged body panels and the open door suggested that the factory floor planking was still in place, still pinned to the framing beneath, though warped and split in several places by the years of unprotected weathering. The undercarriage was accessible from below, which was where she started, on her back in the dirt with a lantern held at arm's length. What she found from beneath was not what she had expected. The floor of a Concord body, seen from below, shows its framing as a grid of yellow pine stringers bolted to the body sills. In a standard example, the planking above the stringers is visible between the frame members, and there is no secondary void. In the coach her father had rebuilt, there had been a secondary framing layer, a shallow box of 1-inch poplar, that created the void above the main structural stringers. This coach had both. It had the primary framing visible from below, as expected, and above it, clearly separate, was a second framing layer she could see only at the edges where the body sill framing left a narrow gap. The secondary layer was still tight. 20 years of weather had not opened it. Whatever was between those two layers of framing was sealed. She spent the second day studying the floor from above. The planking was in poor condition, warped and bleached, but she could see that it was sitting on something other than the primary stringers. The gaps between planks, where they had shrunk with drying, showed a second layer of material beneath, running perpendicular to the top planks. It was not visible in the way that open space is visible. It was the hint of a boundary, a surface that belonged to another layer rather than to the primary framing below. She sat on the driver's box in the early afternoon and thought about this for a long time. If you want to know what is inside a thing, her father had told her once, while they were measuring a disputed wheel hub together, start with what it cannot do. Every piece of construction has a boundary. Find the boundary, and the opening is already in front of you. She found the boundary on the third day. It was at the front of the floor, below where the footwell was originally positioned, where the planking overlapped the front body sill by a distance that was roughly 2 inches more than the structural overlap required. That extra 2 inches was the lid of the cavity. It was pinned in place by 4 cut nails that had been set flush and weathered to near invisibility over the years. She did not rush it. She cleared the area around the pins with the pick, working each one free of the rust and grit that had built up around it. This took most of the third day. The fourth day, she set the pry bar against the overhang of the front sill and applied pressure in the line the framing dictated, not forcing, not levering blindly, but reading the resistance the way her father had taught her, feeling for the point where the material would release along its own grain rather than fracture across it. The nails gave on the afternoon of the fourth day. The front section of the floor lifted as a unit, hinged at the rear, and the cavity beneath it was open. The air that came out of it was the particular cold that belongs to sealed spaces, not the cold of a cellar or a cave, but the cold of a place that has not breathed in a very long time. Nell held the lantern over the opening and looked in. She stayed there for some time without touching anything. If you found yourself wanting to know what she saw, consider that the question has less to do with what was in the cavity than with what it meant. But we will not leave you to wonder. Some things deserve to be named plainly. Inside the cavity, laid flat and wrapped in oilskin that had kept its seal through everything the years had done to the body above it, were 2 items. The first was a canvas envelope, thick with folded papers, tied with a cotton cord that had gone stiff with age. The second was a smaller object wrapped separately, something flat and rectangular, that turned out on unwrapping to be a small leather-covered account book with gilt lettering on the cover that had mostly worn away, though 2 words remained legible. The words were Garfield Southern. She lifted both items out carefully and set them on the driver's box beside her tool roll. She closed the cavity. She folded the oilskin and placed it with the other items. Then she sat for a while in the diminishing afternoon light and looked at the coach around her, at the warped panels and the sprung door and the 2 missing wheels. And she thought about 11 years of the town not looking at it. She did not open the canvas envelope until she was back in her room above Pryor's dry goods store, with the lamp turned up and the evening settled around her. She spread the contents on her bed in the order she found them, which was the order someone had placed them in the envelope with care, not haste. There were 43 pages in all. Some were handwritten on ledger paper, numbers entered in a precise and uniform hand. Some were typed on company paper bearing the Garfield and Southern Stage Line letterhead. Several were carbon copies of correspondence, the kind made with the tissue interleave that was standard in commercial correspondence of the period. And at the back, folded separately and worn at the creases as if it had been consulted many times before, being placed here, was a hand-drawn survey plat of land in the vicinity of Cedar Bluffs, with parcel boundaries marked in ink and a series of notations in the margin that were not in the same hand as the survey lines. Nell had grown up in her father's shop, and her father had been a man of business as well as a craftsman, which meant she had learned to read financial documents at the same age she learned to read letters. She understood what she was looking at. The Garfield and Southern Stage Line, at the time of its dissolution in 1872, had held a deed to 412 acres of land north of Cedar Bluffs, along the creek drainage that fed into the main wash. The deed was recorded at the county level and had appeared in the county rolls at the time of the company's formation in 1866. At the time of dissolution, that land should have been included in the company's assessed assets, liquidated to satisfy the creditors, and its proceeds distributed according to the priority schedule established in the territorial court's dissolution order. It had not been. The county recording for that parcel showed a transfer, dated 2 months before the dissolution order was issued, from the Garfield and Southern Stage Line to a private individual. The name on the transfer was Reuben Pruitt, not Harmon Pruitt, who had sold Nell the coach for $4 and a laugh. Harmon was, she had gathered from casual conversation in Cedar Bluffs, a second-generation man, his father long dead, and the livery inherited. Reuben had been Harmon's father. The transfer was not itself illegal, at least not on its face. Companies sold assets before dissolution all the time, often to settle specific debts to specific creditors. But what the ledger pages showed, in the neat uniform hand she now understood to be Reuben Pruitt's, was that the Garfield and Southern had carried no debt to Reuben Pruitt. What it had carried was a shareholder interest belonging to one Thomas Caswell, the company's founding partner, who had sunk his family savings into the line in 1865 and held a documented 40% share of all company assets. The transfer of the 412 acres had been executed without Thomas Caswell's knowledge or signature. His share of that land at the liquidation values the territorial court would have assigned was 164 acres, or their cash equivalent. That equivalent by the price of land in the Cedar Bluffs area in 1872 was somewhere in the range of $900, a considerable sum. A sum that had been taken from Thomas Caswell's estate and transferred to Reuben Pruitt through a document executed in the 2-month window between the decision to dissolve and the actual filing of the dissolution order, when the company's books were in flux and its creditors were occupied with their own claims. Thomas Caswell was dead. He had died in 1874, 2 years after the dissolution, and his property had passed to his wife and then, after her death in 1879, to his daughter, who was still living in Cedar Bluffs. Her name was Ida. She was 51 years old and had worked as a seamstress since her husband left the territory in 1876. She lived in the small house on the south end of town near the creek, the one with the kitchen garden that still produced well despite the drought of the past 2 summers. Nell knew who Ida Caswell was because she had noticed her in the way that a woman alone in an unfamiliar town notices another woman who is also, in her own way, alone. And because she had seen Ida's name in the county recorder's index on the afternoon she had spent going through the historical filings, looking for the Garfield and Southern records that were supposed to be there, and were notably incomplete. She had not known why those records were incomplete until now. She spent the rest of the evening going through the papers a second time, and a third, making notes on her own paper in her own hand, tracing the transfers and the ledger entries against the survey plat. She was not a lawyer. She was not a clerk or a court officer. She was a woman who knew how to read a document the way she knew how to read a floor, by following the structure beneath the surface, tracing what the framing said about the thing it supported. By the time the lamp burned low, she had a clear account in her own notes of what the oilskin envelope contained and what it demonstrated. It demonstrated a transfer of land from a dissolved company, executed in deliberate advance of the dissolution order in a manner that deprived a legitimate shareholder of his portion of the company's assets. It demonstrated this not through accusation, but through the company's own internal records, preserved in the account book and the ledger pages, against which the filed county transfer could be checked. The next morning, she went to see Ida Caswell. She did not explain everything at once. She arrived at the South End house at 7 in the morning, before the heat built, and introduced herself plainly. Ida came to the door in her work clothes, a small woman with gray-brown hair wound tight at the back of her head, and eyes that had learned not to expect much from visitors before 8 in the morning. Nell told her she had been doing some research into the Garfield and Southern dissolution and had found some documents she thought would be of interest to Ida's family. She asked if she might come in. Ida let her in. She did not say much while Nell laid the papers out on the kitchen table, because Ida was the kind of woman who understood that speaking before you had finished reading was a waste of everyone's time. She read the ledger pages and the correspondence and the transfer document and the survey plat without asking for explanation. When she reached the end, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. "My father always said Reuben Pruitt took something from him," she said at last. "But my father was not a man who kept good records, and when he brought it to the county clerk, there was nothing on file that supported the claim. The transfer was filed. The dissolution records showed no pending dispute, because the records that would have supported the dispute were in that coach," Nell said. Ida looked at her. "Someone put them there," Nell said. "Someone who knew what they showed and who wanted them out of reach but could not destroy them outright. The account book was the company's internal record. Destroying it would have been a greater crime than concealing it. So it went into the floor." Ida was quiet for a while. Then she asked who had put the documents there. Nell said she did not know, and that was true. The oilskin wrapping was not labeled. The placement was careful enough to suggest someone who understood the construction of that coach floor, which pointed toward a company employee, or perhaps toward someone in the freight business who knew vehicles. But there was no name on the oilskin and no note of explanation inside the envelope. "It may have been someone in the company who disagreed with what Reuben Pruitt did," Nell said, "or someone who intended to retrieve the documents later and was prevented from doing so. The coach went to Pruitt's livery by whatever arrangement Harmon claims, and after that no one with reason to look for it knew where to look. 11 years. Ida sat with her hands on the papers. She was not weeping, and she was not speaking. She was the kind of woman who had learned to hold a very large thing very quietly. "What do I do with this?" she finally asked. "You take it to the Territorial Land Office in Beaver," Nell said, "and you take a lawyer with you if you can find one willing to look at the recording history. The transfer document and the ledger together make a clear case for the land having been wrongly conveyed. The land itself has likely changed hands since then, which makes the direct recovery complicated. But the underlying claim, the debt Reuben Pruitt's estate owes the Caswell estate, that is documentable now. It was documentable before, too. It just had no evidence." Ida looked at the account book with its 2 remaining words on the cover. "My father spent 2 years trying to prove this," she said. "He went to Beaver twice. They told him there was no paperwork. There is paperwork now," Nell said. "The process that followed was not swift, because it never is when the original wrong is a decade old and buried in the archive of a dissolved company, and the people who committed it are mostly dead. But it was not stopped. The Cedar Bluffs County Recorder, when presented with the ledger and the transfer document by the lawyer Ida had retained in Beaver, opened the historical filing and found exactly the gap in the Garfield and Southern records that Nell had identified. The gap was consistent with the extraction of specific documents in the period before the dissolution order was filed. The Territorial Land Office took the matter on appeal and assigned it to a reviewing clerk. who spent 3 weeks comparing the internal ledger against the recorded transfers and produced a written finding that the 412-acre parcel had been conveyed in a manner inconsistent with the company's shareholder obligations. Harmon Pruitt, when the clerk's finding was presented to him through legal correspondence, did not rage or argue. He had not made the original error. It had been made by his father, and he was too careful a man to compound it with a public dispute. He agreed to a cash settlement with the Caswell estate, the amount calculated by reference to the land values at the time of the original transfer, and the interest that would have accrued on a debt of that size over 11 years. It was a significant sum. Not a fortune, but enough to mend a roof, pay a debt, and change the character of a woman's days in a way that 1,000 small economies could not. The settlement was handled through the territorial court without public proceeding, which meant that most of Cedar Bluffs learned about it in pieces, through the ordinary mechanics of small-town information, the way news travels when it is too specific to be rumor and too quiet to be announcement. The sum was known, in a general way, within a week. The reason for it took longer, and when it was fully understood, it required a second act of revision on the part of people who had held certain things as settled. The settled thing that required revision was the $4. The town had laughed at the $4, not loudly, but in the way of shared private knowledge, as a shorthand for a certain kind of romantic foolishness. She had paid $4 for a ruined coach that would cost 30 times that to restore to working condition, and that had no practical use as it sat. It was the kind of purchase that confirmed a prior assessment. She was, the shorthand went, someone who did not know what things were worth. What Cedar Bluffs understood by the end of the autumn was that the $4 had been, in a strict accounting sense, the most precisely valued purchase in the town's recent history. The woman who spent it had known exactly what she was looking for, had known roughly where to look for it, and had found it by means of a skill that almost no one in the town possessed, and that she had never announced, because there had been no occasion to announce it, and she was not the sort of person who announced things. People began to see her differently, and the seeing differently was not comfortable for everyone, because it required a simultaneous revision of what they thought they had understood about the old coach and about the woman who bought it, and about what competence looks like when it does not perform itself. Pruitt himself said very little. He was in the awkward position of a man who had laughed at a customer and then had his father's unsettled estate brought to account by what that customer found, and there was no graceful way to stand in that position. Nell did not gloat. She had no interest in gloating. She had come to Cedar Bluffs because she had heard, from a former Garfield and Southern driver who had wintered in Parowan 3 years back, that the company's old equipment was scattered and partly unaccounted for, and that the dissolution had left a residue of unresolved questions that the county recording history did not fully answer. She had come to look, which was what she did. She had found, which was what happened when you looked in the right way with the right preparation. She stayed in Cedar Bluffs through the winter. She was not unwelcome. Ida Caswell, who was a woman of standing in her own quiet way, introduced her to people, and the town extended the kind of cautious, watchful hospitality it extends to someone it has revised its opinion of and is not yet sure how to place. The coach remained in Pruitt's yard because it was still hers, and she had no immediate use for it and no means of transport. In the spring, she hired 2 men with a timber frame and a set of jacks to move the coach to a shed at the edge of town that she had negotiated the use of from a widow named Gorse, who owned the property and had no use for the shed herself. She began the restoration methodically, in the order the work required, starting with the running gear and working forward. She had no particular plan to sell the coach when it was done. She had no particular plan beyond the work itself, which was the way her father had always approached a restoration, one joint at a time, one surface at a time, without deciding in advance what the finished thing was for. Cedar Bluffs saw her at the shed most days, in her cream dress and the red shawl she put over her shoulders in the early mornings when the air was still cold, and it came to understand that she was not a temporary presence, not someone passing through on the way to somewhere else. She was someone who had arrived and found what she came for, and was still here, doing the work that was hers to do. The account book and the 43 pages went to the Territorial Land Office in Beaver, where they were filed as supporting documentation for the Caswell estate settlement and entered into the permanent record. The oilskin wrapper was kept by Ida Caswell, who put it in a cigar box in her kitchen alongside the 2 letters her father had written to the county clerk in 1873 that had gone unanswered. She said it was a kind of company to have them together, the original effort and the thing that finally answered it, in the same box, which seemed to her an appropriate arrangement. The cavity in the coach floor was cleaned and sanded, and in time fitted with a single piece of new poplar planking that matched the original factory dimensions. It was not a hiding place anymore. Nell made it a structural element, a part of the floor it had always been beneath, and she fitted it with a flush brass ring on a pivot that let it be opened as a maintenance access panel if the need ever arose. It was, her father would have said, the correct use for it. A thing built with care deserves to be used with care, not preserved as a curiosity or explained as a secret. The secret was gone. What remained was the floor, sound again, doing what a floor is for. She put her hand on it on the day she fitted the planking, pressing her palm flat against the new wood, the way you press a bandage against a healed place, not because it needs pressure anymore, but because the hand remembers what was there. The draw knife she had inherited from her father hung on the shed wall above her workbench, its blade oiled and its handle smooth with 30 years of someone else's grip before her own. She looked at it sometimes in the middle of the morning, when the light came through the shed door at the angle that made the grain of the handle visible. She knew how to be patient with a thing. She had been taught. She went back to the work. That winter in the shed taught Cedar Bluff something it had not expected to learn, which was how a restoration actually proceeds. The town had no particular language for it. The men who worked with animals understood maintenance and replacement. The women who worked with cloth understood mending and alteration. But the patient dismantling and reconstitution of a complex wooden vehicle, joint by joint and surface by surface, working from the ground up in the order the structure itself dictated, that was a different kind of knowledge, and it operated differently in the eye of an observer. People walked past the shed on their various errands and looked through the open door when the weather was mild enough for the door to be open. What they saw changed with the weeks. First the wheels, which Nell had located in pieces across Pruitt's barn and a neighboring property and a junk heap behind the freight office, where one had been used as a decorative element for some years until it was recognized and restored to its proper company. She trued both rear wheels using a spoke set and a truing board she built herself from spare lumber, and she fitted new iron tires at the forge in the blacksmith shop on the east end of town, because fitting iron tires required a forge, and she did not have one. The blacksmith, a man named Vane who had been in Cedar Bluffs for 20 years and was professionally incurious about other people's projects, took the measurement she gave him and cut and shaped the tires without comment and received his payment. Without comment. And the whole transaction was conducted in the language of competence that two people who understand a craft will sometimes find themselves speaking with each other even when they have never spoken before. The wheels went back on the coach in November. Passers-by who had been watching from the road understood that something had changed, that the shape of the thing had been amended, though they couldn't always have said precisely what. In December, the body framing. She had to source several replacement members from the lumber yard in Beaver, ordering to the original specifications she had derived from her father's notes and from her own measurements of the surviving members. The yard owner in Beaver, when she arrived with her written list, looked at it for a moment and then looked at her and asked where she had learned to draft a material specification in that format. She told him. He sent the lumber on the following week's freight, and he took $1 off the price without explaining why. The body panels came in January and February, new white pine fitted to the original dimensions and primed with red oxide before the weather warmed enough for finish painting. She did not rush the priming. Her father had told her once that a finish is only as good as the preparation beneath it, and that the preparation cannot be seen from outside, which meant that the only person who would ever know whether you had done it correctly was you, which was the only standard worth caring about. By March, the coach was standing on 4 sound wheels with solid body framing and primed panels, the door rehung on new hardware, the driver's box reshaped and sanded. It was not yet painted. It was not yet finished. Cedar Bluffs could see it clearly now through the shed door, and what they saw was a vehicle that was becoming, against all prior expectation, a vehicle again, and the woman who was making it so had become, correspondingly, a different kind of figure in their understanding. She was not a romantic figure in the way that strangers sometimes become romantic in small towns, elevated into a symbol of something the town imagines it lacks. She was a practical figure, which was more durable and, in the end, more useful to the town's actual self-understanding. She knew how to do a thing that nobody else in Cedar Bluffs knew how to do, and she was doing it plainly, in a shed on the edge of town, in her cream dress and red shawl and practical boots, and she was not asking anyone to admire it. The admiration arrived anyway, not loudly, in the form of small acknowledgments, the blacksmith stopping to look at the fitted tires and nodding once, the lumberyard freight driver who had delivered the body panels saying to the person he delivered to next that the woman restoring the old stagecoach was doing it right, by which he meant he recognized the quality of the work, having handled enough rough and careful lumber in his time to know the difference. Pruitt himself walked past the shed one afternoon in February and stood at the door for a moment looking in, and said nothing, which was more than he would have said in September, and less than he owed, and both things were true simultaneously. Ida Caswell visited the shed in March when the settlement had been concluded and the document had been filed, and the cigar box in her kitchen had acquired its final occupant. She walked the length of the coach slowly, running one hand along the primed side panel, not touching with the presumption of ownership, but with the thoughtfulness of someone handling a thing that has figured in her story. "My father built something too," she said. "Not coaches. He built a route. He ran the Garfield and Southern's first relay station, out past the North Creek, back when the line was new and everyone thought it would last. He built the corrals himself, dug the well. He put 20 years into that company before it went under. He should have had what he was owed," Nell said. Ida looked at the coach. "He knew it too," she said. "He just couldn't prove it. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from knowing a thing true and having no means to demonstrate it. He carried that exhaustion the last years of his life. The papers gave you the means," Nell said. Ida nodded. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stripped interior where the new seat framing was measured and waiting for upholstery. "I always wondered why no one found them sooner," she said. "Because no one knew what to look for," Nell said, "and because the coach was sitting in plain sight in a yard where everyone assumed it had been accounted for." "That is a particular kind of hiding," Ida said. Nell said she had thought the same thing. The spring came with the particular quality of high desert springs. Warm days and cold nights, and a clarity of light that made the sandstone cliffs to the south look close enough to touch in the morning before the haze built. Nell mixed the finish paint to the original Concord specification, which called for black body panels and a deep red-orange on the wheel spokes and the driver's box trim. The original Garfield and Southern coaches had used a cream stripe on the door panels with the company initials in gilt, but she left that off. The coach was not a Garfield and Southern vehicle anymore. It was not a company vehicle of any kind. It was a vehicle restored to working condition by a woman who knew how, and she painted it without a legend. On the morning, she finished the final coat of body black and stood back to look at it in the full light from the open shed door. The draw knife caught the light from the bench behind her, as it sometimes did, and she was aware of her father the way you are aware of a thing that is present in the room without being in the room. A presence carried in the tools and in the knowledge of how to use them. He had told her when she was old enough to be serious about the work and young enough to still ask him questions she later understood he had been waiting for, that a vehicle is not like a building. A building, when it is done, is still. A vehicle is finished only when it moves. The finish is the question. The road is the answer. You do not know if you have built it right until it is under load and in motion, and the thoroughbraces are taking the weight the way they are meant to take it. The draw knife hung on the wall. Its blade was the same blade he had fitted to it 30 years ago. The handle was smooth where his hand had shaped it, and her hand had continued to shape it, and the grain of the hickory had gone dark with oil and use, until it was almost the color of the road dust that came through the shed door in the afternoons. She put her hand on the door panel of the coach and felt the paint, which was dry to the touch, but not yet set to its final hardness, the way new paint needs a few warm days to fully cure. It would be ready by the end of the week. She had already been asked by a freight company operating out of Beaver whether a restored Concord pattern coach in working order might be for sale, and she had said she would consider it, which meant she had not decided. She was not in a hurry to decide. The work was finished when it was finished, which it was not quite yet. And after it was finished, there would be another question, and another job, and another thing that needed the attention of someone who knew how to look at it carefully. And she trusted that the next thing would present itself in the way the last thing had. The shed door stood open to the spring morning. The coach stood in the light, black and red and sound, on 4 wheels that turned freely, with a floor that had no more secrets in it. Nell picked up the draw knife from the bench and set it in its place in the tool roll, and folded the canvas over it, the way she did at the end of every day, because her father had taught her that a tool put away carefully is a tool ready for the next use. She went to close the shed door. She paused for a moment with her hand on the frame, looking back at the coach in the amber morning light, and then she closed the door behind her and walked back toward town.